All right. So, can you all see the slides and hear me? I guess if no one speaks up, I'll just continue. Thanks a lot, David, for this very nice introduction. Also, thanks a lot for having me and even more for organizing this amazing seminar series. I really try to attend whenever possible, and I've learned a lot during it. So today it's my turn, and I hope it will be entertaining to all of you. And maybe you will also learn one or the other thing. I'm going to talk about representational drift and how it reflects on an ongoing balancing of stochastic changes by Hebbian learning. For a quick overview, first I want to quickly define what is representational drift. It might be boring for some of you, but probably there's also some here that haven't or that are not too familiar with representational drift. Then I'll talk a bit about the stability paradox within representational drift. I'll focus on mechanisms underlying drift. Then I'll model it. And in the end, it's going to be a bit more philosophical. I'll talk about representational drift and statistical learning. So what is representational drift? Yeah, this is has been a very influential study by Jens-Bastian, where they looked at place cells in hippocampus. What you see here is on the x-axis position of the animal on a linear track, and on the y-axis cells ordered by their place fields, and then color-coded the activity. What you should see is that at each location there's a specific group of cells active, and the cells really reflect the position of the animal, or the cell's activity really reflects the position of the animal on this linear track. What is striking though is if you look at the exact same cells at different days, this representation is not present anymore, or at least not as strongly pronounced as on the day where the cells were defined. What happens is that some cells lose their response or drop out of this representation. Others shift their preferred location. And if you do this exact same procedure for different days, we always see that there is a nice representation. However, the cells that make it up are changing. So place cells undergo changes in tuning. Others drop in and out of the hippocampal representation of this linear track. This phenomenon that for stable perception and stable behavior, the neural representation changes has been termed representational drift, and it has been found by now basically everywhere you look. So I have some example studies here. There are way more. I'm not aware of any experiment where they look for representational drift and do not find it. So yeah, the problem, of course, here is that at the same time that we measure this drift, behavior and sensory impressions can remain remarkably stable over weeks, months, or sometimes even a lifetime. So think, for example, about a song you liked as a teenager. Whenever this song will come up on the radio, you will remember it and recognize it, maybe even in decades. And the thing is, you might even remember most of these lyrics. So it is very, very stable. While at the other hand, we have representational drift. So basically the neuronal activity associated with stable behaviors or sensory representations is not static, but changes over the time span of hours to days. So of course, the question is, how does this fit together? How is this perceived stability achieved in the presence of representational drift? To address this, we teamed up with experimental collaborators. Dominik Aschauer was a PhD student and later postdoc in Simon Rumpel's lab. Looked at two-photon calcium imaging data in mouse auditory cortex. Mice were head fixed. They were passively listening. In total, it were 12 animals, 121 fields of view, more than 20,000 neurons. The imaging happened after habituation for imaging sessions that were 2 days apart. and the mice didn't have to do anything for this part, just listen to a set of sounds. And this is what the data looks like. So on the left, you see a coronal section of mouse brain, and you see that the neural markers in green and red are nicely expressed in auditory cortex. On the right, you see an example field of view. There's two channels. In red is the soma marker, it's a structural marker, so we are able to track the individual cells across imaging time points. And in green is an activity marker, so we can read out the activity of these cells. After some pre-processing, this looks like what you see here on the right side. This is example activity traces for 10 cells. Each vertical line represents a stimulus presentation. The color of the arrowhead at the top is the stimulus identity, and in green you see the activity traces. And what you probably immediately can see is that some cells respond to some of the stimuli. After some further pre-processing, basically deconvolution and sorting by stimulus, what we get is this here. On the x-axis is the trial number for an example stimulus. On the y-axis, we have the neuron identity. And we see that the population response to this stimulus is largely stable within a session. So most of the time, the same neurons are evoked, and the response is evoked in the same neurons across all trials, more or less. However, if you track the same neurons across time, what we see, and yeah, maybe a bit similar to Yaniv's plots, is that sometimes this response changes. So here, for example, I would say from day 1 to day 3, there's little change, but on day 5, some completely different cells are active. On day 7, no cell is active anymore in this given field of view for this stimulus. Another example would be here for another stimulus, where on the first imaging day, there's no response. Then on day 3, 2 neurons are responsive. On day 5, 2 completely different neurons are active, which then remain stable until day 7. So this is how representational drift looks like in mouse auditory cortex. So population responses disappear, they emerge, or they change from imaging time point to imaging time point. To quantify this, what we did is we counted for a given imaging day how many stimuli evoke a response in one field of view, and then looked at the next imaging time point, how many stimuli evoke the same response, different response, or no response. And what we found is that across 2 days, only 50% of stimulus responses remained stable. 20% evoked a different response, and 30% evoked no response anymore. The last part was largely counterbalanced by a similar amount of stimuli gaining a response. So we found there is a lot of change going on. So we were interested in, is there anything stable? And to do this, we have to go away from the single stimulus responses, but look at responses to more stimuli. What I show you here is for 5 example neurons and 15 example stimuli, their response profiles. The stimuli are pure tone stimuli, so and they're sorted by frequency. So it's not surprising that individual neurons respond to like similar stimuli and with a preferred frequency in the middle. What we see here is, if you look at or track these neurons across time, that there is some change going on. So the activities of the individual neurons drift. What, however, does not drift is the correlation between response vectors. To explain how I got here is, instead of only these 5 neurons, I pooled activity of neurons across fields of view to get 1,000 neurons, and looked for these 1,000 neurons. I had the response vectors. I correlated the correlation of response vectors, and this is what I then depicted here. So what you see is the similarity of response vectors to these 15 stimuli. And yeah, they are sorted by frequency or by sound frequency. So what you see is not necessarily surprising on an individual day, that similar frequencies evoke similar responses. What we were somewhat surprised about, however, was that this is exactly the same across imaging time points. So we have the same representation, even though the individual activities change a lot. And this is also seen in, if you look at the what we call representation, or it's basically principal component analysis of the above. And also here you see that the picture is preserved. So always the blue are together. There's always this U shape, and the yellow ones are then again grouped together. Now, I've been talking about representational drift and what we see. I even said that representations are preserved during representational drift. So now I feel is the time to talk about what is a representation. And this is not so straightforward, maybe. And here I want to highlight an idea by Shepard and Shipman from 1970s that was later put into words by Edelman as representation is a representation of similarities. And this might be a bit, so let's talk about what is meant by this. So if we think about neuronal population responses, quite often they are described as some sort of manifold. This manifold can have any form whatsoever. Normally it's low dimensional compared to the neuronal activity dimension. But as we do not have more than 3 dimensions, I constrain myself to 3 here. And as it can have any shape, I just picked a rook from a chess game. I specifically highlighted 8 stimulus responses that are on a circle on the surface of this rook. And what we now imagine is happening is that this manifold is moving through neuronal space. So always activities change, but in itself it is maintained stable, so that the order of these 8 stimuli in a circle is always maintained. To give you show you what this means for this example, if we consider the 3-dimensional coordinates of all of these 8 stimuli, and I mean as an equivalent to neuronal activity, they change with the rook moving. They are have very different positions. But what is maintained, as you can already see in the top, is that they are always arranged in the circle. So if I compute the distance matrix between the neuronal response vectors, or the position vectors, what I get is, of course, always this circular structure that is both visible in the similarity matrix and in the principal components. So basically, what I want to say here is that the representation of the stimuli in a circle is preserved, even though the activity is not. And this has been observed not only by us, but also by other people in other areas. So Gallego et al. Found that in motor cortex, the relationship between movement directions is maintained despite changing of the neural activity. Similar in hippocampus, Steintuch et al. Found that it preserves spatial representations while individual neurons activities vary very much in a way that I started this presentation showing Yannick Sif's plots that where basically also the representation, which would be the representation of this linear track, is always kept, but the individual neurons drop out and in. But this had also been found by Deitch et al. In visual cortex, where the population level structure for natural stimuli is maintained over days, even though the individual neurons changed their activities. So briefly, a brief first summary. We found that Individual neurons show substantial drift in their response properties during representational drift, but the population level representations remain remarkably stable. So the question is, how can this fit together? There's several ideas out there for what might be the reason or the cause for drift. And one maybe rather obvious or naive one is that the synapses in a network drift, so it should also affect probably the network responses. And what you see here is an imaged dendrite with spines. The spines are the little protrusions, and they are basically postsynaptic sites. And it has been shown that their size can be used as a proxy for synapse efficacy. So what you see here is that some synapses are rather stable, others change a lot in size. For example, this purple one here in the top shrinks quite a lot, and then other synapses come and go. So there's a lot of change. This is also depicted here on the right. It's basically a plot showing how many spines were there at a given time, and then each very thin black line would be one spine, and then it was checked on a consecutive time point if it was still there. And what we see is that a lot of the spines disappear or appear, and also what you might see is that if you collapse all the black parts on top of each other, the number is largely the same. So to summarize this, like 60% of the spines are eliminated within 20 days. 70% of the stable spines of the remaining ones change their size by at least a factor of 2 within these 20 days. And this has also been shown in the absence of activity. So when activity was silenced, there was still a similar amount of synaptic drift. The other idea that's out there is, so the question is, can synaptic volatility alone explain representational drift? The other idea that's out there is that continuous learning might be the reason for representational drift. The hypothesis here is that continuous learning inevitably would lead to representational drift in a way that neural networks constantly update their synaptic weights in response to all activity. So like Hebbian fire together, wire together. There's always activity in a network, so there's always co-activations of neurons. This would always lead to changes in synapses. So if you take 2 snapshots at different time points of the same network, it will be different, and then also result in a different response. So or when you present the same stimulus, because all intervening experience modify the network. This has been very nicely put forward by Deval et al. In their recent preprint, where they modeled this basically. They showed that they modeled that, or the idea is that between 2 exposures to the same stimulus, animals encounter different stimuli. They called it memory. So they had this pink memory that was reoccurring. But of course, in the meantime, the animal experienced stuff. This stuff evoked some activity. This activity, in turn, evoked Hebbian plasticity. So this changed the synapses of the network. And when then the stimulus was presented again, the response is a different one. The similar, and this has to result then in representational drift. Similar idea, or that continuous learning is to blame for representational drift, was put forward by Recerca et al. Here they trained an artificial neural network using stochastic error descent, and the thing they introduced is unstable synapses. And what they found is that there were 3 phases of a learning process. First was an rapid initial learning. So basically, the network learned to represent the environment. They used the environment to train the network. Then there was a slower consolidation phase. And this is where normally in machine learning you would stop, because now the network has learned. But when they kept on training the network, what they found is basically dynamics that resemble representational drift. And you can imagine it like this figure here. So initially, the ball would roll down into this valley. But then within this valley, there is a lot of solutions that are equally good. And as the network is noisy, it will the ball will then still keep moving around in a more or less random trajectory. So yeah, this adds, or the idea that Hebbian plasticity is an essential component of representational drift. And now what we wanted to do is to test this in experimental data. When I say we, this work was mostly done by Thomas, who's a former PhD student in my PhD advisor's lab, and we used signal and noise correlations to do so. So quickly, what are signal and noise correlations? We looked at the same data set as before, but now we looked at tuning curves, more or less. So what we have here is for each stimulus in black, the single trial activity, and in purple, the averaged across trials activity for each stimulus. And yeah, we compared this across neurons to compute the signal correlation. For the signal correlation, we just computed the correlation between tuning curves. And this is a measure of the stimulus-driven co-activation of pairs of neurons. So basically, if neurons are always co-active to the same stimulus, the signal correlation would be high. We then subtracted this median tuning curve from the black trace to get a residual activity. And with this, we computed the so-called noise correlation. That is a measure for the stimulus-independent co-fluctuations of pairs of neurons, and is often used as a proxy for effective connectivity. We first wanted to quantify how stable they are. And yeah, to do so, we looked at the distribution of signal correlations, and this is remarkably stable across days. So basically, it looks similar to ones that have been published, a peak around 0 with a tail towards higher correlations. But this, of course, doesn't tell us anything about the stability of individual signal correlations between pairs of neurons. So what we did is we binned this distribution by signal correlation. And if it was stable, then we would expect that for each bin, the neuron pair's noise signal correlation would be at a similar location. But what we get instead is that all of these more or less look the same, or basically it seems like the signal correlation is collapsing towards a mean, basically, or yeah. So here you see the mean for each bin, and for the same neuron pairs, the mean on day 3, and it's collapsing to or seems to be collapsing to a common mean. So it is very unstable. Maybe this was also to be expected because, I mean, earlier I talked about representational drift. This is another measure for this. So if we have drift, this cannot be completely stable, at least. And then we did the exact same for noise correlations. And here we saw a similar picture. The distribution looks slightly different. But in the end, we also see that the noise correlations are subject to significant chances. And again, here, maybe not too surprising, because what I showed earlier when we looked at the synaptic spines, also synapses are subject to changes. So the next thing we wanted to do is to use signal and noise correlations to get an idea of the Hebbian plasticity that is going on in the system. To do so, we took signal correlations as a measure of stimulus-driven co-activation of a pair of neurons. So basically, this is like a Hebbian fire together. If there now is a synapse between these two neurons, this will definitely be strengthened if we have a high co-activation of these neurons. So this firing together will lead to a wiring together. And if we have a wiring together, this again has to be reflected in the noise correlations. I know noise correlations are effective connectivity, so they can have different sources. They can come from shared inputs. They can come from multisynaptic connections, but at least this way it works. So if we have a synapse that is strengthened, this will also strengthen the noise correlation. So if we see high signal correlation at a time point t, this and high noise correlation of the same between the same pair of neurons at a time point t+1, this is a proxy for Hebbian plasticity. So we set out to look at exactly this. How we did this, we used one of the or for each bin of noise correlation. Here I took the highest bin. So we grouped all neuron pairs with a noise correlation between 0.6 and 1. And we looked at how strong is this on day 3. This is, but this is part of a plot I showed previously. We subgrouped this now by signal correlation. And what we found is on day 1, there's no big effect. So basically within this noise correlation group, there is no subgrouping of signal correlation. But on day 3, we see this very nice spread. So neuron pairs that had a high signal correlation on day 1 had like less decrease in noise correlation on day 3. And this was really ordered by color, so by signal correlation subgroup. This was not only true for the highest noise correlation group, but also for the lower ones. You always find this very nice sorting of noise correlation by signal correlation. We, of course, checked the other way around too. And here we don't see this effect. So I think it's most visible in panel F, where you have more of a mix of colors, so of noise correlation subgroups. To quantify this, we looked at the spread index or prediction index. We computed this by as the sum of the differences between consecutive subgroups. So as we look at correlation, this can be 2, meaning maximum spread from 1 to -1. This can be 0 for no spread or random spread, -2 for maximum spread in inverse order. And what we saw is for signal correlation preceding noise correlation, we saw a clear effect that was even more pronounced for higher noise correlation groups. But this is probably due to the fact that there we have the probability of having a synapse is higher. So if we have a low noise correlation group, then the signal correlation doesn't have that much of an effect. Interestingly, we saw a way smaller effect the other way around. So from this, we might already conclude that there is Hebbian learning during representational drift. To get a more direct readout of the stabilizing effect that we see, so less decay in noise correlations, we looked at next at basically the stabilization more directly. And for stability, what you can do is you scatter the noise correlation on day 1 versus the noise correlation on day 3. If it was stable, we would expect this point cloud to be very close to the diagonal. We see, however, that this is not too stable, so there is some spread. In total, we have a Spearman rank correlation of 0.18. But we did this now for individual signal correlation subgroups. So, and what we saw here is that the higher the signal correlation is, the higher the stability of the noise correlation. So of course, we have fewer entries as well, but they move way closer to the diagonal. And we also can quantify this by looking at the Spearman rank correlation. And we see a near linear dependency of noise correlation stability on signal correlation. The other way around again. So we see signal correlation stabilize noise correlations. The other way around, this effect is not so pronounced. What we see here is that independent of noise correlation subgroup, we have a higher stability of signal correlations in total, but there is no stabilizing effect of noise correlations on that. So it's the blue line almost flat, almost independent of noise correlations whatsoever. So to summarize these findings, we see that signal and noise correlations both show a very high volatility, and we see the signal correlations predict and stabilize future noise correlations. Now, is there a minimal model that can capture these observations? To model this, or maybe first, what should the model include? The model should include highly volatile signal correlations and should reproduce the highly volatile noise correlations, and it should reproduce the predictive and stabilizing effect of signal correlations on future noise correlations. So we used a linear firing rate model. Probably most of you are familiar with these sort of models. If not, I really briefly go through it. If you're interested in details, you can look at our preprint that is on bioRxiv. We have n neurons. In our case, we took 250, but it didn't really matter. We could vary this. We have here the firing rate, Ri of neuron I. We have the connection from neuron J to neuron I saved in the connectivity matrix M. We have stimulus input to neuron I, and we have noise. And this noise is mostly just used so we can calculate the noise correlations in the exact same way as we did for experimental data. We initialized the following, or the matrix as randomly drawn from a Gaussian but symmetric, and we normalized it to a maximum eigenvalue of 0.85. We initialized the stimulus input randomly from Gaussian, and the noise was also Gaussian. Next, we wanted to look at plasticity mechanisms. Basically two kinds, random ones and Hebbian ones. And the random ones, we just used an Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process because this leaves the Gaussian distribution in a steady state. We applied this to either input or connectivity. So I wrote X here instead of S or M. We have the mean and the standard deviation of the original distribution that we want to keep. And we have the step size delta t and dt and the dw standard Wiener process. And we have one free parameter that we changed. That was the omega. That's the rate of change. So to basically see what is happening. Then we have another plasticity mechanism, that's Hebbian-like learning. What we did here is to get to the new connectivity matrix from the old one. We interpolated between the old connectivity matrix, or that's from a previous time step to the next time step, and a sort of Hopfield-like term, that is the outer product of the stimuli that were shown to the network. We here have a normalization constant alpha that is used to keep the system, or to keep the maximum eigenvalue of the system stable. And then we varied the learning rate gamma. Again, one parameter that we varied. And now we tested the different configurations. So first, can stochastic changes account for the three observed measures: the signal correlation volatility, the noise correlation volatility, and the predictive effect of signal correlations on noise correlations? If we only have drift in the input, what we see is that the signal correlation changes. maybe not so surprising. We see no changes in the noise correlation because also the network doesn't change. And in our case, yeah, the input has nothing to do with the noise correlation, only the network. And for this predictive effect, we see basically none. So we varied the input drift and yeah, see no predictive effect of signal correlation or noise correlation. If we now vary only the network, so let the network connections drift, we again see signal correlation volatility because the signal correlation is in parts due to the input and in parts due to the network. So this is changing. Now, as the network is changing, also the noise correlations are changing. But again, we see no effect or no stabilizing or predictive effect of signal correlations or noise correlations. If we combine the two, again, we have volatile signal correlations, volatile noise correlations. Now, instead of only one parameter, we have to vary two, the input drift and the network drift. But again, this matrix is basically flat, so we see no predictive effect of signal or noise correlations. Okay, so stochastic changes alone seem to not be able to capture representational drift. Next, have a look at Hebbian plasticity. Here, basically, the network is adapting to the inputs, and we see that after an initial learning phase, there is no signal correlation volatility anymore. The network converges, and that's it. So the signal correlation volatility is not given. Same for the noise correlation volatility. Again, after convergence, there's no change anymore. However, interestingly, we see a predictive effect of signal correlations or noise correlations already for very low learning rates. So here we have the exact opposite picture than in the previous slide. Of course, the solution now lies on the hand. What is happening if we combine the two mechanisms? So first, have a look at input drift and network plasticity. Here we have signal correlation volatility. Now, as the network is adapting to the inputs, also the noise correlations are volatile. And we have sizable space in parameter combinations where we see a predictive effect of signal correlations on noise correlations. Similarly, for network drift and network plasticity, again, we have, even with completely stable inputs, signal correlation volatility as the network is changing. We have noise correlation volatility, and again, we have a space in parameter or a portion of parameter space where we see this predictive effect of signal correlations or noise correlations. And maybe not surprisingly, if we combine the two or the three mechanisms, we see the same. Here I only plotted the input drift versus the learning rate for a given network drift parameter. If you want to see all the matrices, they are in the supplemental information for our preprint. So again, this works. Now we have basically two different models that could explain our observed effects, the input drift and network plasticity, and the network drift and network plasticity. So they have slightly different interpretations. So for the input drift and Hebbian network plasticity, what we see is that inputs change, or the idea is that inputs change all the time, and the network is continuously trying to catch up. This is maybe similar to ongoing statistical learning and reminiscent of De Waal et al., where they showed that input statistics can account for a huge portion of observed representational drift. The second interpretation, or the interpretation of the second case, is there's network drift and network plasticity. And here the idea would be more like the recurrent synapses drift all the time, so they randomly change. And then the continuous learning of a static input that is always the same keeps them from running away. This is a bit reminiscent of Jin et al. And Ratzon et al., where ongoing synaptic learning with together with synaptic noise, led to representational drift. Now, the summary of this part is that to account for observations during representational drift, the network needs both stochastic processes and Hebbian learning. So maybe now coming more to the philosophical part, is drift now an inevitable consequence of statistical learning? To answer this, first, what is statistical learning? And maybe not every one of you is familiar with it. So the idea is that neural networks learn to reflect the structure of their inputs. It originated from studies of infants learning languages by basically picking up on the statistics of these languages. But now it's it's a very common framework in machine learning and also computational neuroscience. The example I want to give here is, so if the inputs have a circular structure, like colors in our perception of color space, the idea is that neural representations will develop a matching circular arrangement. So the network mirrors the underlying topology, and this maybe only by having like matching the idea that close colors should also be represented in close proximity. So red and orange should be closer than red and green. And then you follow these individual basically the idea that similar inputs lead to similar neuronal representations. You follow this throughout. So red is similar to purple, purple is similar to blue, and so on. And you will inevitably get this circle. So the geometry of the neural activity then reflects the input statistics. Now, our idea, and when I say our, it's like work I'm or a review I'm currently working on with Simon Rumpel and Matthias Geschuber, is if we have drift as only a stochastic process, so without statistical learning, what might happen is that this changes completely freely, not preserving any stability, and then thus making it impossible for the brain to interpret what we see. To visualize this, I have a little schematic. The circles are neurons responding either to stimulus A in red, to stimulus B in blue, to both stimuli purple, or to neither in white. The representation being the representation of similarity would mean that the overlap between the stimuli A and B reflects their similarity. So basically, the number of neurons that should respond to both stimuli has to be kept stable, even though the representations themselves would, or the activities themselves would change. And the idea is that if we don't have like a guarding rails provided by statistical learning, what might happen is that this breaks down and we see very varying overlaps. So sometimes little, sometimes a lot, sometimes no overlap at all. Contrarily, if there is a stochastic process balanced by statistical learning, what we might expect is that the activity patterns themselves change almost randomly, but always this overlap or the amount of overlapping cells in purple are preserved. So the idea here is that statistical learning might maintain neural representations by balancing the stochastic process. In a way, this might be like a bit like herding cats, where we have a very stochastic element, the cats, that are being kept in check by the shepherd or the dogs. So let's get to the conclusions. So I want you to take away today that neural activity patterns drift substantially at a single cell level. However, global representations remain stable during representational drift. Then there has to be, in order to account for our experimental observations, drift has to reflect a balance of stochastic changes and Hebbian learning. And thus, maybe in a more functional idea, representational drift might enable at the same time both stability and adaptability in neural circuits. With that, I want to thank my current supervisor, Alex, my former supervisor, Matthias, and the people involved in the work done for this presentation, which would also be Thomas, Simon, and Dominic, and collaborators at Max Planck, Florida, Yingxue and Chuyang. And of course, you for your attention. If you're interested in more details of this study, you can check the preprint, or I guess now is the time to ask me questions.